Parshas Yisro. This week's share has been kindly sponsored in honor of Nati and Zevi Bookman. If you wish to sponsor a future share, please be in touch. The highlight of this week's Sedra is obviously Kabbalas Torah, Parshas Yisro, Kabbalas Torah, and in that awesome moment of revelation from Hashem, we know that Hashem delivered the Aseret Adibros, which is translated by many as the 10 Commandments, not like the Reform like to say the 10 suggestions. I did want to start this share, I did want to get into the topic of why these 10 in particular were chosen. I looked around a bit and it seems to be, aside from Rav Sadia Gaon, we're going to touch on a bit later, but it's basically based a lot on Kabbalah, which is beyond my pay grade. So suffice it to say, it's still a matter of curiosity to me, because if you think about it, why were these 10 highlighted amongst all the other 613, etc.? There's plenty of work to do there, but we're not going to concentrate on that today. Instead, I want to focus more broadly on the significance and the message behind specifically the Aseret Adibros, but also Maamad Har SIni more generally. And let's ask three questions. Firstly, Maamad Har SIni was an experience. It was clearly there as a demonstration of something very, very powerful. It was such a what we call in Hebrew a maamad. It was an event. It was an experience of incredible scenes. And the question that was actually posed to me a number of weeks ago, and it made me think about it, was why was it necessary to even have such a revelation in such an enormous way, with such an enormous experience, when we literally just had Yetzias Mitzrayim? Yetzias Mitzrayim in its own way was a great display of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's might, and why was it necessary to have another display? That's the first question I want to try and deal with. The second question is, why was it necessary, and clearly it was necessary because the Torah makes such a big deal out of it, why was it necessary to have all the dramatics along with the giving of the Torah? If you think about giving of the Torah in a very sort of toned down, neutral way, perhaps in a more secular way maybe, you just think of the Kabbalas Torah as a moment where Hashem gave over the Bible to the Jewish people. Hashem gave us the responsibility to keep Torah mitzvahs. Why does it need to come with an entire huge display of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's might and turning the world upside down almost, and literally turning mountains upside down and all the rest of it? Why was that necessary as part of the experience? And the third question that follows from all of that is, what is the lasting and transformative message that we can take away from the Parsha of Aseret Adibros and Maamad Har SIni? So let's begin with what actually was given over by Har SIni. We know obviously that Aseret Adibros was said, but what was given over? So Rav Sadia Gaon is famous for saying this, and the truth is I found it literally all over the place. The Rambam says it, the Midrashim are full of it. We'll see soon, it's even a Gemara. That all 613 mitzvahs, whenever we talk about Tariag mitzvahs, it's not just 613, it's 613 plus. Those are the kind of the core principles, but there's plenty that comes along with it. So the entirety of Torah was transmitted by Har SIni through the Aseret Adibros. I want to try and explain that and expand that a little bit more. So we're going to focus on a Gemara first to begin with, in Makkos Daf Chof Gimel Amud Beis. We're not going to go through the whole Gemara, because it's a long Gemara, but we're just going to quote a few lines. And the Gemara begins, Chof Gimel Amud Beis at the bottom, Dorash Rav Simloi, Sheish Meos Ushloish Esrei Mitzvahs Nemru Lo Moshe. 613 mitzvahs were said to Moshe, and it's clear from the context of the Gemara continues that it means by Har SIni. So by the way, there you have another clear makor, a clear source for the idea that we said before, everybody knows from Rav Sadia Gaon, the whole Torah was somehow transmitted by Har SIni. But we'll expound on this. So firstly, the Gemara says 613 were given by Har SIni. Then the Gemara continues, astonishingly, Bar David v'hemidan al achas esrei. David HaMelech came along and he reduced the number of mitzvahs, seemingly, to 11. And Rashi, in case you were wondering on the meaning of that, Rashi comes to explain, black and white, in the beginning, everyone was tzaddikim, they could do the whole Torah. But with Doros Achronim, wasn't so poshut. So comes David HaMelech along and he was mamayat. It's a very strange Rashi, if we may say so. It's very, very difficult to comprehend, because the Gemara doesn't even stop there. The Gemara continues, Bo Yishayahu v'midin al Yishesh. Yishayahu came along, reduced the Torah from 613 to 6. Bo Micha v'midin al Sholish. Micha came, he reduced it to 3. Choza Yishayahu v'midin al Shtayim. By the way, I'm missing out lines of the Gemara here. The Gemara goes into the Psukim to elaborate on this, but I'm just getting to the point. Yishayahu came, and he reduced it further to 2. And here comes the real punchline. Bo Habakkuk v'hemidan al Achas. Habakkuk came along, and he reduced the entirety of the Torah to 1. Shenema, the tzaddik b'emunaso yichya, a tzaddik lives with his emunah. Now, if you follow Rashi's logic, that would mean, seemingly, that the Torah is being reduced more and more and more until we're left with one mitzvah.
That's it,
No emunah. Yeah, that's all we're left with, just emunah. It's very strange. And it's not me who asked the question either. The Maharsha asked the question and he says, Hakusha mefursemet bozeh, v'chibo levatil kol shar mitzvahs. Does Rashi mean that we're coming to cancel all the other mitzvahs? Surely not. It doesn't make sense to say pshat in this Gemara, as it would seem to sound like from Rashi, that we are cancelling most of the Torah because, it doesn't really work anymore. Doesn't make sense. So Maharsha goes through a number of different approaches, but what he comes to and what we're going to elaborate on is the Mahalach of the Rambam. And it's a Rambam that's based on a pshat in the Mishnah, the last Mishnah in Makkas, which is a very famous Mishnah in its own right. And the Mishnah goes like this: Reb Chananya ben Akasha oimer, Rotza HaKadosh Baruch Hu lezakos es Yisrael, lefikach hirbo lehem Torah mitzvos. Reb Chananya ben Akasha says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to bring merits to Klal Yisrael, so therefore he increased the Torah mitzvos that were given. Now there's a very simple question on this logic. If you want to make Klal Yisrael more meritorious, if you want to give them easier opportunity to be righteous, then give them less mitzvahs. Give them less to do right, which means less to do wrong and mess up, and then that's a shortcut to them becoming more righteous. How does it make sense to say, yes, you wanted the Klal Yisrael to be more meritorious, so you gave them more responsibilities, in brackets, that they may mess up? Very strange. And this is a kasha that the Mefarshim ask. The Rambam comes along, Pirush HaMishnayos, and he says, if you haven't heard of this Rambam before, you may be quite astonished to hear it. But the Rambam says, Mi yisodes ha'emunah b'Torah, she'im kayim ha'odam mitzvah, mi shalosh esrei v'sheish esrei mitzvahs. If a person, it's from the emunah that we know of the Torah, if someone is makayim, if someone fulfills one mitzvah out of 613 mitzvahs, and he says, how does he fulfill it? No other incentives. As you might imagine, we're talking about someone who does a mitzvah absolutely properly. He's already in the door. That's how he gets to the Mabah. One mitzvah properly, in the Mabah. Says the Rambam Pshat in Reb Chananya, Ki machmas ribuy ha-mitzvahs I efsher shelo yaseh ha'odam achas b'chol yemei chayev b'shleimus. The increasing amount of mitzvahs that we have essentially is increasing opportunities so that a person should have at least one opportunity in their life where they'll get this right. It's not that the Torah expects of us to get it all right. The Torah expects of us to have an attitude of trying, but with the hope that at least we'll get one through the door. So it's just interesting because we always brought up, I think everyone like myself was brought up with the idea of this image of keeping Torah mitzvahs as an accumulative act. You do as many mitzvahs as you can, cram your day with as many mitzvahs as you can, and at the end of life you have millions of mitzvahs and now you'll be alright. But from the Rambam, it's quite clear he's learning and Pshat in the Mishnah, to get to Mabah you need only one mitzvah. But as we said, that mitzvah needs to be done properly. Koroi, chahoigen, lo shotaf imoy mator zalim hazeh klal, can't be with any other incentives. Asal lishma, me'ava, of course it has to be done properly. But essentially it's quality over quantity. That's how the Rambam learns Pshat in the Mishnah. But we're going to deepen our understanding of this. And I'm not claiming that the Rambam necessarily means this, but for us as a takeaway, I think it's important that we add this in and potentially take this route. The Mashal speaks this out. Now, if you think about it, all of Torah, the entirety of Torah, is really only one mitzvah. From Hashem's perspective, Anochi Hashem Elokecha pretty much sums up the entire Torah. But you know what? Because we're human beings, we can't deal with the enormity of that. We won't be able to interact with that mitzvah to the fullest depth and the fullest meaning of it. So the Torah breaks it down to 613, and as we said, plus mitzvahs. So whichever way we turn in our life and whichever day we wake up on, and whoever we meet and whatever we try and do in life, we are surrounded by mitzvahs. for the purpose of living with Anochi Hashem Elokecha. Says the Marsha, that which HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us, Tariag mitzvahs, Shesar lavin, Ramachi asin, Boho riboy mitzad ha-mekabel, all of this increase, all of this numerations of mitzvahs, are all because of us on the receiving end. Ki mitzad ha-noisin Baruch Hu, because from HaKadosh Baruch Hu's perspective, Kulam hen ki mitzvah achas, it's all one mitzvah. Anochi v'lo yelecha. So the Marsha is saying all of Torah is one mitzvah. The one mitzvah of Anochi. And now we come to Habakkuk. Says the Marsha, you know why Habakkuk reduced the entirety of Torah to one mitzvah? Doesn't mean he gave us less to do. It wasn't he was taking out pages of the Shulchan Aruch. That wasn't what Habakkuk was about. Rotzaloma says the Marsha, Kol ha-mitzvahs nichlolim b'mitzvah rishona shehi emunah. All of the mitzvahs are included in the very first mitzvah, which is the mitzvah of emunah. Sheshamanu b'pi agvura, we heard that from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's what Habakkuk meant when he said, Bo Habakkuk v'midon alachas. It doesn't mean that Habakkuk was ignoring parts of the Torah. What he was doing was he was focusing with a single-minded focus on the core, the fundamental core that drives throughout the Torah, through all mitzvahs. One core, with tzaddik mamnoso yichya, live with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. First, the Pashtas is the Marsha in his Pshat is like Rashi. But the truth is, I was thinking about it. You could actually explain Rashi in that as well. Beginning with tzaddikim, we're able to think on many levels and in many different ways. Then we simplified the process. We simplified the whole Torah. It came down to one fundamental core. Well, let's not get complicated. Let's not add layers on and I don't know. But you're right. The simple matter seems to be that he disagrees with Rashi. So, by this point, what we've established, okay? At this point we've established is, number one, all of Torah was given by Har SIni. We say, as I said, it's famous from Rav Sadia, but the Gemara says so, and Midrashim say so. All of Torah was given by Har SIni, somehow, in some form communicated. And what we've suggested is with the Marsha we understand how. Because when we say all of Torah, says the Marsha, all of Torah is one mitzvah. All of Torah comes down to one core, one yesod of emunah. And that's Pshat, as we've said in Habakkuk, that he focuses all of our keeping of Torah mitzvahs in one direction. That's the focus, that's the core.
You've got Hillel, the story with the person who comes to him with, says he wants to learn all Torah standing on one foot. Yeah. And he says, he doesn't say anything about Amunah to.
You should know anyway, that's a very good question. What was Hillel doing? Saying, I mean, surely it's about Hashem. Like, well, you think, how can you miss out all that? So, I don't know, but it's a good point. It's a good point. Now there's more to this. Let's move on. If you look at the Gemara in Shabbos Peiches on the base, you will see many statements which point to the grandeur and to the incredibly out of this world experience that was Maamad Har SIni. And we're just going to pick just two, just to make the point. Rabbi Shlomo Levi says, "Kol dibur v'dibur sheyotzu b'pi HaKadosh Baruch Hu yotzon nishmason shel Yisrael." Every dibur, every one of the Aseres HaDiburs that was said, Klal Yisrael lost. Yotzon nishmason shel Yisrael means they died, essentially, right? They died, and the Malachim came and brought them back. The funny thing is, a few lines later in the Gemara, Rabbi Shua ben Levi, the same person, says the following: Kol dibur v'dibur sheyotzu b'pi HaKadosh Baruch Hu chozru Yisrael la'achareihem shnei masor mil. Whenever they heard the dibur from Hashem, they were so terrified they ran 12 mil back. So Mefarshim asked, well, hang on a second, did they die or did they run away? So it's a very interesting Ksava Kabbalah. And he writes as follows. I'm going to read you out the Lashon because I think it really brings out a point which we haven't yet said. It says that the Ksava Kabbalah, it's actually in Dvorim, but he writes that when Klal Yisrael was standing by Har SIni, they were like a Novi. They were essentially experiencing HaKadosh Baruch Hu like a Novi experiences Hashem. But then he describes something which is really detailed and graphic in physical terms. He says, Eivareihem hoyu mizdazim, their limbs were trembling. V'koyach gufam hoya koshel, their physical strength was weak. Eshtaniseihem mistarfois, their mind became confused. V'loy nishar bohem koyach, they didn't have any energy left. This sounds like a real physical breakdown of the system. Why? He says, Kedei sheloy tiyeh bohem machshova klal, be'echod midvorim betelim v'loy mehavle azman v'sach v'loy sof. In order for Klal Yisrael, in that moment of Har SIni, in that moment of Kabbalah Satorah, for them not to have any single thought of any distraction, of any thing that's going on from Havli Azman, of the world news. We didn't want anything going on in their minds. For them to be completely and totally focused and drawn in to what was going on in that moment. Says the Ksava Kabbalah, you know when the Gemara says, Yotzason Ishmason, they didn't die. Says the Ksava Kabbalah. Ein kavonosam yitzias nefesh mamish. Rather, he says, it means chulsha hagdola hakorov lemisa. It means the breakdown of the physical body that they were experiencing, this tremendous weakness that they were overcome with, that can be compared to death, and he brings psukim to bring out that point. But essentially what he's saying is they did run 12 mil, they're from a very, very weakened state. They were brought to the real brink. Why? What was the purpose? And the Ksava Kabbalah lends itself to what we're about to say. What happened by Har Sinai was not merely giving of the Torah as one might understand it educationally or informationally. The HaKadosh Baruch Hu had a book, a treasure trove, a tremendous amount of value to give the Jewish people and say, go live this book. That's not the only thing that went on. It was a reset moment. It was a moment when Klal Yisrael became born as a nation of loyal and dedicated servants to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, where from that moment on, HaKadosh Baruch Hu became the focal point of our life, of our service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In fact, it was an entire shift in perspective. It is what is called a paradigm shift. A paradigm shift is where a person operates until the paradigm shift, according to a certain framework of beliefs and understanding and a way of seeing the world. And what happens with a paradigm shift is it changes everything. It's a complete right angle turn. It's a complete 180 turn. You turn and you see everything in completely different light. What Klal Yisrael experienced by Har Sinai was a breakdown of everything that was normal until that point. They didn't even have control of their physicality. They had nothing. They were completely stripped away. All they had was Borei Olam standing there talking to them. That's all they had. And in that moment of Har Sinai, that was a message that was transmitted. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, complete and total subservience to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And to elaborate on this point further, I want to bring to you an unbelievable medrash, which Rav Shimon Shva brings. It's a medrash Tanchuma HaYoshon, so not in all the versions of Medrash Tanchuma. The Medrash says, Omar Rab Nechemia, Mahu Anoichi, Loshen Mitzrihu. The word Anoichi, which we know, the Aseret HaDibros begins with, the word Anoichi, says Rab Nechemia, was actually an Egyptian word. And you know why, he says? Because all the years that Klal Yisrael in Mitzrayim, Lomdu Sichoson Shal Mitzrayim, they learned the language of the Mitzrayim. Once Hashem redeemed them, he wanted to give them the Torah. They didn't know to listen. You know what Hashem says? I'll talk to you in your language. I'll speak to you in Loshen, Egyptian language. Enoich, this word Enoich is Loshen Enoich, which is a Mitzri word. Rav Shimon Shvab looks at this medrash and he asks three questions, what we call in Yiddish, three bomber kashas. First of all, it's not the first time the Torah is using the word Anoichi. It's been used many times. In fact, he says it's been used 70 times already by this point in the Torah. So don't tell me Anoichi is an Egyptian word. Question number one. Question number two. If they truly couldn't understand Lashon HaKodesh, Klal Yisrael, then why not give all Aseret HaDibros in this Egyptian language? If you're already being friendly and nice, let's do it all the way. Give 10 Aseret HaDibros in Lashon Egyptian. We don't find that. And thirdly, he asks, this is famous already from when we were children, the Mechilta Parshas Boy famously said that one of the praises of Klal Yisrael was Sheloi Shinu Es L'Shoinom. They didn't change their language. In other words, they precisely did not learn Egyptian language or use Egyptian language instead of what they were used to, which was Lashon HaKodesh. So why is the Medrash saying that they didn't know Lashon HaKodesh and Hashem had to change the language, the Egyptian language? He says what the Medrash means is not the literal pronunciation of the language. He's not talking about the language of Egyptian versus Lashon HaKodesh. What the Medrash means to point to is what words in the language represent. The Medrash is pointing to a culture. Apparently, Enoch in Egypt is the word for I. Says Rav Shimon Schwab, the Egyptians' outlook on the world was selfish and self-centered. They lived with a culture of Enoch. They lived with a culture of putting themselves before everything else. And unfortunately, because the Yidden spent so many decades in the company of the Mitzrayim, they also picked up on that. And they also lived a little bit selfishly and also thought of themselves as important before anything else. When the Ribbono Shel Olam stood up by Har Sinai and he delivered the Torah, the first word HaKadosh Baruch Hu said was Enoch, Anoichi. Says Rav Shimon Schwab, Pshat in the Medrash, the Ribbono Shel Olam was teaching Klal Yisrael a message. Says Hashem, you know, the only one, the only being who can ever say I, who can ever be so important as to be the only thing that matters, says Hashem, is me. With the strength of the statement of Anochi Hashem Elokecha, HaKadosh Baruch Hu removed any lingering effect that the Yidden still carried from their time in Mitzrayim, where they may have thought otherwise about how important they were. The Ribbono Shel Olam sets the record straight with the first word, and the most important word of the Aseret HaDibros, Anochi. HaKadosh Baruch Hu communicates, you know that Egyptian approach, you know that culture you might be used to? Not anymore. What's important, says Hashem to Klal Yisrael from now, that you understand, is I, Hashem, am the only one that really, really matters. And when you live your life, you be subservient to me, says HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So in the beginning, the first half of this year, we spoke the idea of Emunah being represented in Anochi Hashem Elokecha, because that's the obvious meaning of Anochi Hashem Elokecha. What we've now learned is there's another side to Anochi Hashem Elokecha as well, which is the hisbatlus, the subservience, the complete and total commitment and loyalty that we have to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So, the Gemara that said all of Torah was said by Har Sinai, with the Marshal, we've explained that 613 mitzvahs plus are merely pieces of the same fundamental principle of Anochi Hashem. And Anochi Hashem means to live with Emunah. Of course it does. That's what it's all about. But the other side of that coin of living with Hashem is living with a complete and total submission to His will. It's a life of asking, what does Hashem want from me now? And in order to get Klal Yisrael to shift from the way they were thinking up until that point to thinking in those terms going forward, it was necessary to bring them physically close to death. In Yiddish there's a phrase, arois von kelim, intensely overwhelmed by the experience of Hashem's revelation to the world. That's the point at which we had to bring Klal Yisrael to, in order for them to almost be reborn. To have a completely new experience of life from that point going forward. And of course, with that in mind, as a Yidden, we live with that recognition without even realizing it so much of our lives. And we sing on Simchas Torah and we say every single day in davening, Baruch Hu Elokeinu, shebra'onu lichvoidoi. This is our mantra. This is our way we live life. This is our battle cry, our motto. We live in His honor. We live for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We live to bring Kvod Shemayim to this world. So in summary, we asked three questions. We asked, why was Maamad Har SIni needed if we already had Yetzias Mitzrayim? And what we've tried to say is, it's not just about HaKadosh Baruch Hu's revelation to this world and HaKadosh Baruch Hu's might and recognizing Hashem's in charge. Of course, that's also part of it. And yes, that was the focal point of Yetzias Mitzrayim of Kriyas Yamsuf, where we saw that. Etc. We saw tremendous revelation of Hashem in that regard. But what happened with Maamad Har SIni was so much more. HaKadosh Baruch Hu almost Kaviyachal beat us to submission. We haven't even got to the Gemara that talks about the mountain over our heads and how, Shom Teik for Raskan was a threat that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave Klal Yisrael, and there's many other spokes to this wheel we haven't touched on. But the Yisod, we've said that we were brought to a case of bittul. We were brought to a place of complete and total subservience to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That was part of the whole incredible experience that was Maamad Har SIni. And that answers the second question we asked. Why was it necessary to have all the dramatics for Hashem? The thunder, the lightning, the noise of the lightning, and there was so much going on that was bamboozling. And as the Ksava Kabbalah writes, Klal Yisrael were completely, as we say in Yiddish, Aros from Canaan, they were completely overwhelmed, physically overwhelmed by this whole situation. The Gemara says they died, or maybe they nearly died. You're talking about incredible transformative experience that was going on. It was all necessary to drive home the point. From now on, life is different. And our last question was, what is the lasting and transformative message behind the Maamad Har SIni? So essentially, I think we've said two things. First of all, to have the focus and to realize that in the core essence of all of Torah is Anochi Hashem Elokecha. When you put your shoes on in the morning in the right way, it's in service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's recognizing HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the Melech HaOlam. It's connecting to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Every mitzvah that we do, in whichever way we do it in every single day of our lives, is connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Anochi Hashem Elokecha. And the flip side of that, the second half of that, we've said, was what happened by Maamad Har SIni, which was a complete and total subservience, his battles to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, a recognition. What it means to be a Yid is to live al pi Hashem, to focus on doing the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and recognizing that that's what every day of our life should be about. And Munah HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and recognition that we are here to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shkoyach.